March 12, 1945. From the observation post atop the Siebengebirge hills, the Ruhr stretched beneath General Hermann von Salza like a wounded beast. Smoke curled upward in black and gray plumes, blotting out the late afternoon sun. The hum of distant aircraft, more than 100 Allied bombers, was a constant reminder of the sky's new owners. In the valley below, industrial furnaces once feeding the German war machine were now nothing but glowing skeletons, twisted metal and shattered brick. Von Salza's binoculars trembled in his hands, though not from the March chill. Each city, Dortmund, Essen, Duisburg, was a patchwork of fire and ruin. He could see the Red Ruhr River glinting red and orange in the reflection of the flames. Factories that had churned out tanks, artillery, and ammunition for years now lay in ruin. Every so often a building would collapse, sending a plume of dust and debris into the sky like the last gasp of a dying colossus. The general's aide, Hauptmann Weber, approached cautiously, his face pale, breath visible in the cold air. Mein General, the Luftwaffe attempts to respond, but they are overwhelmed. They cannot hold them off. Von Salza lowered the binoculars. The truth he had been avoiding for months was unavoidable now. Even the senior officers of the Wehrmacht could no longer pretend that the Reich's industrial heart would recover. Factories that had been meticulously camouflaged, guarded, and repaired after every raid were now reduced to skeletal remains. Every time he had flown over the Ruhr in reconnaissance, he had known destruction was coming. But seeing it firsthand in real time was something different. This was devastation on an almost biblical scale. The air smelled of burning oil and steel, acrid and choking. Von Salza's throat tightened and he swallowed hard, feeling the weight of years of strategy, victories, and campaigns collapse in that acrid haze. He could hear the faint rumble of the city's remaining infrastructure, trains struggling along twisted tracks, alarms echoing in the distance, the occasional rifle shot, but it was all drowned out by the roar of bombs falling earlier that morning. He turned to Weber. "Do you see it?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. This is no longer a war. This is the end of our war machine." Weber swallowed, eyes shifting to the burning horizon. "Yes, mein General. The Ruhr is finished." Above them, the sky began to darken with the smoke of yet another raid. The general's gaze hardened, not with resolve but with grim acceptance. He thought of the soldiers on the Eastern Front, the families in Berlin, the factories in Munich. How little it would matter now. Germany's capacity to wage war had been stripped bare, and the fire over the Ruhr was the undeniable proof. In that moment, von Salza did something he had avoided for years. He allowed himself to imagine the war's end. Not the glorious victory he had been taught to envision, but the silence after the fire, the ruins of a once mighty nation, and the long march of Allied soldiers through streets now emptied of production, morale, and hope. The Ruhr burned. And as he watched, General von Salza understood something that officers of his rank rarely admitted. The war was lost. March 13, 1945, 04:30 a.m. Above the gray veil of the Ruhr Valley, the first bombers of the morning approached, their engines humming like 1,000 angry hornets. General von Salza stood at the edge of a crumbling observation tower, wrapped in a thick overcoat, the wind cutting through him like steel. He could see the silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses, precise in formation, their flares tracing arcs across the clouds as if marking the territory of inevitable destruction. Below, the valley seemed almost unreal, a miniature world in flames. Von Salza's eyes, accustomed to maps and tactical sketches, scanned the once bustling factories, now shattered mosaics of brick, metal, and fire. Steel frames twisted grotesquely. Smokestacks leaned at impossible angles, coughing soot into the sky. The ground trembled under the distant detonations, each shockwave a reminder that the Reich's industrial pulse had been severed. Hauptmann Weber handed him a report. The numbers were staggering. 347 sorties flown the previous day, over 200 tons of bombs dropped on Essen and Dortmund alone. Casualties were mounting, not just among civilians but among the forced laborers and remaining factory crews. Von Salza didn't flinch at the figures, they were abstract, but when he looked again at the flames licking the horizon, he felt a deep, hollow ache. Every ton of explosives was stripping away the Reich's future, piece by piece. The Luftwaffe tried to intercept scrambling Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs from the surrounding airfields. Von Salza watched through binoculars as tracer fire crisscrossed the clouds, engines screaming in deathly spirals. A bomber was hit. A flash, then a slow descent into the smoky valley. Yet for every aircraft downed, another 5 replaced it. The scale was unimaginable, relentless, unyielding. The German anti-aircraft guns, once symbols of national pride, were reduced to desperate staccato bursts against an advancing tide they could never hope to stop. Von Salza's mind drifted to his own experiences commanding panzer divisions years before, maneuvering across Poland, France, and Russia. Those battles he had believed were decisive. Now he realized they were mere prelude. The Allies weren't fighting armies. They were dismantling the very foundation that allowed those armies to exist. The Ruhr was the lifeblood of Germany's war machine. Its destruction was the declaration that the machine itself had failed. The general lowered his binoculars. Smoke, fire, and the distant cries of alarm bells filled his senses. Somewhere in the city, a factory foreman shouted orders to salvage what little equipment remained. He could see workers running with sacks of tools, their movements frantic and futile. Von Salza's stomach tightened. Even his training, even his pride offered no solution. The war he had dedicated his life to managing and winning was being systematically undone, and there was nothing he could do but watch. Hauptmann Weber touched his shoulder lightly. Mein General, command from Berlin. Reich leadership expects a defensive consolidation. But the Ruhr, it is no longer defensible. Von Salza did not respond immediately. He let the rumble of distant bombers fill the silence. Then finally he spoke, voice low and unsteady. No, it is finished. Not tomorrow. Not in weeks, today. His words were carried off by the wind, almost lost among the chaos, yet they were resolute. For the first time he admitted aloud what he had long feared in private. The Wehrmacht could no longer sustain itself. As morning gave way to noon, the thunder of the skies continued unabated. Von Salza, standing on the ruined tower, felt a sense of helplessness so profound it bordered on awe. The Allies had not simply bombed factories, they had shattered the illusion of invincibility, stripped the Reich of its industrial sinew, and forced even seasoned generals to confront the ultimate reality. The war was over. March 14, 1945, midday, Duisburg. The sun, obscured by a thick canopy of black smoke, cast the streets in a dim orange twilight. General von Salza moved cautiously along the outskirts of the city, his boots crunching over shattered glass and debris. The air reeked of burning coal, scorched metal, and the acrid tang of chemicals from ruptured industrial tanks. He felt it in his throat with every breath, a sharp sting that reminded him this war was no longer abstract strategy. It was a living, choking horror. Around him, civilians moved like shadows, faces etched with exhaustion and terror. Mothers clutched children to their chests, their eyes hollow with the realization that safety had become a distant memory. Workers, some still in soot-stained overalls, scavenged what they could from the ruined factories. Tools, scraps of metal, even paper. Their movements were mechanical, survival-driven, and profoundly human amid the mechanized destruction surrounding them. Von Salza's aide, Hauptmann Weber, kept pace silently, clipboard in hand, noting the decimated infrastructure and the scattered personnel. They passed what remained of a Krupp steel foundry. The main assembly hall was unrecognizable. Molten steel had cooled in jagged, useless chunks across the floor, and conveyor belts hung like broken spines from the ceiling. Von Salza ran a gloved hand along a twisted beam. The steel was cold now, but its destruction burned hotter than any fire he had ever known. Nearby, a small group of soldiers attempted to salvage artillery shells from a collapsed warehouse. Von Salza approached one, a young lieutenant barely 20, soot-covered and trembling. "How many remain operational?" he asked, voice low. "Perhaps a dozen, sir, at most," the lieutenant replied, eyes darting nervously toward the horizon where new smoke plumes were rising. "The rest were destroyed, or taken by the bombing." Von Salza nodded, the weight of command pressing down harder than ever. Every factory lost, every shipment destroyed, every railway cut, was another nail in the coffin of the Wehrmacht's ability to continue fighting. Yet even as he acknowledged this reality, he couldn't suppress the gnawing unease in his stomach. This devastation was not abstract numbers. It was flesh. It was human lives. It was the end of an era built on industrial might and military pride. A distant explosion shook the ground beneath them, and dust rose like a specter from the street. Von Salza instinctively ducked, scanning the sky for bombers, but there were none above at that moment. The city itself seemed to shake with the aftershocks of previous raids, as if the very foundations of Duisburg were trembling in despair. He realized, painfully, that even if the Allied bombing stopped tomorrow, the damage was irreversible. The factories would not rise again. The infrastructure would not heal. Germany's capacity to wage war had been stripped to a skeletal shell. Weber glanced at him, eyes reflecting both fear and understanding. Mein General, even the troops are talking about surrender. Morale is gone. Von Salza's lips pressed into a thin line. He had long known that morale would falter eventually, but seeing it in the streets, in the exhausted faces of soldiers and civilians alike, made the reality undeniable. For decades he had believed in the disciplined, indomitable Wehrmacht. Now he realized it was not discipline that sustained an army. It was resources, industry, and the will to fight, all of which were disappearing beneath the black smoke of the Ruhr. He paused near a collapsed overpass, looking at the molten slag that had seeped into the river below. The flowing metal glimmered like liquid fire, a reminder that even in death industry still burned. Von Salza understood, with a clarity he had never experienced before, that the war's outcome was no longer determined on battlefields or in command rooms. It was being dictated by destruction, by fire, by the relentless power of the Allies' air campaign. As evening fell, the general returned to his temporary command post on the hill. He gazed out over Duisburg, now little more than a shadow of itself, and for the first time allowed himself to confront a truth he had buried deep. The war Germany had waged for years was over, and nothing remained but the ruin it had left behind. March 15, 1945, late afternoon, a reinforced command bunker on the outskirts of Essen. General von Salza entered the dimly lit room, the scent of damp concrete and old maps mingling with the lingering smoke from distant fires. Around a long table, senior officers of the Wehrmacht were gathered, their faces lined with fatigue and unease. Reports lay scattered across the table, numbers of destroyed factories, decimated rail networks, and the estimated tonnage of bombs dropped over the Ruhr. The sheer scale of devastation was now undeniable, even to the highest-ranking military minds. Von Salza's boots echoed against the concrete floor as he approached the head of the table. Oberst Graf Müller, a seasoned strategist with steel-gray hair and a voice usually unwavering, looked up from his report. General, the Ruhr is beyond repair. Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg. They cannot produce more than a fraction of last month's output. Without them, our tanks, our artillery, our ammunition, it's over. Von Salza nodded, steeling himself. He had spent years analyzing the production capacities of these factories, planning offensives based on their output, assuming the Reich's industrial engine would sustain any campaign. Now, confronted with reality, even the most hardened officers could no longer deny the truth. He could feel the room's tension, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant acceptance, like soldiers watching a collapsing front line through binoculars. Gentlemen, von Salza began, voice low but deliberate, we have always measured strength in manpower and machinery. We have relied on our divisions, our armored corps, our factories. And yet, he let the pause linger, the unspoken words filling the bunker. Without the Ruhr, there is no strength left to measure. The war is lost. A murmur ran through the room. Some officers avoided eye contact, others clenched their fists in silent frustration. Oberst Müller cleared his throat. Sir, if we accept this, the implications, politically, strategically, it is catastrophic. Berlin will not admit defeat willingly. Von Salza allowed a grim smile, bitter but honest. It does not matter what Berlin wants to believe. The war is dictated by reality, not wishful thinking. And reality, gentlemen, is that our industrial heart has been ripped out and burned before our eyes. From a corner of the room, a young Hauptmann interjected, voice shaky. But General, what of the remaining troops? Couldn't we consolidate, fight defensively? Von Salza shook his head slowly. Consolidation requires resources, fuel, ammunition, reinforcements. The Ruhr provided these lifebloods. Without it, consolidation is merely delaying the inevitable. Any attempt to resist will be symbolic, not strategic. The officers fell silent, each man processing the statement. Von Salza's eyes scanned the room, catching fleeting glances of fear, resignation, and the rare flicker of anger. They had trained, fought, and strategized their entire lives for decisive victories, yet here they were confronted with a single, unstoppable truth. The Wehrmacht's might was meaningless without the infrastructure that fed it. Outside the bunker, distant explosions reminded them that the sky above the Ruhr remained hostile territory. Smoke rose in thick columns from the once mighty industrial centers, a visual testament to the Allies' relentless campaign. Von Salza could hear the faint hum of aircraft overhead even now, a reminder that the enemy would not pause, that their destruction was ongoing and unrelenting. He exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of command pressing on him more than any battlefield ever had. "Record this meeting," he said quietly. "Every officer here must understand the reality. We are no longer winning battles. We are surviving the consequences of our own devastation." In that bunker, the senior leadership of the Wehrmacht came face to face with a bitter, unalterable truth. The industrial heart of Germany had been destroyed, the war machine rendered impotent, and no amount of strategy or courage could reverse what the Allied bombings had wrought. It was not a matter of pride or morale or willpower. It was final. March 16, 1945. Night had fallen over the Ruhr Valley, and the sky was an angry swirl of smoke and smoldering fire. General von Salza stood alone on the ridge outside Essen, the remnants of city lights flickering below him like dying embers. The once proud industrial centers, Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, were now smoldering ruins, skeletal structures silhouetted against the orange glow of infernos. The thunder of distant bombers still rolled over the hills, a relentless drumbeat that would not cease. Von Salza lit a cigarette, the small flare illuminating his stern features for a brief moment. He inhaled slowly, letting the acrid smoke mingle with the smoky air around him. Each exhale was a meditation on what had been lost. Factories that had churned out tanks and artillery, rail networks that had moved men and materials with clockwork precision, the arteries of a war machine now severed by the firestorm above. Memories of his campaigns came unbidden. Poland, France, Russia. In those battles, victory had seemed tangible, achievable through strategy, skill, and courage. Now he realized the true strength of the Reich had never been its armies alone. It had been the factories, the steel, the railways, the industrial heartbeat that powered every advance and sustained every retreat. That heartbeat was gone. A faint rumble to the east drew his gaze. Fires had broken out in a nearby industrial complex, sending sparks into the sky like flares of warning. Soldiers and civilians alike scurried through streets that had become a labyrinth of rubble and chaos. Von Salza recognized a bitter irony. The German war machine, which had once struck fear across Europe, was now a victim of its own vulnerability. Its cities, its infrastructure, its people, all targets for a meticulously planned aerial campaign that had stripped it to its bones. Hauptmann Weber approached quietly, eyes scanning the ruined valley. "Mein General!" Reports from Berlin indicate further panic. Supply lines are broken. Reserves are dwindling. Even senior command is urging consideration of surrender. Von Salza shook his head slowly, staring into the inferno below. "It is not surrender, Weber, it is acknowledgement. Not a strategic decision, but a recognition of fact. The Ruhr has burned. Our factories, our railroads, our ability to produce, all of it is gone. We cannot fight this war anymore. Not with honor, not with pride, not with the men we have left." The young officer hesitated, then whispered, "So, the war is over?" Von Salza's gaze did not waver from the horizon. "It has been over since the skies above the Ruhr became a furnace. The armies may still march, the guns may still fire, but the machine that sustained it all, is dead." He dropped the spent cigarette onto the frozen earth, crushing it underfoot. The act felt symbolic, almost ritualistic. For decades, he had dedicated his life to maintaining, commanding, and perfecting that machine. Now, watching the flames dance across the Ruhr, he understood that nothing could resurrect it. Not courage, not strategy, not the indomitable spirit of the Wehrmacht. The valley echoed with distant explosions and the occasional scream, reminders that human suffering and chaos continued, even as the strategic war had already been lost. Von Salza felt a strange calm descend over him, the kind that comes only when inevitability is finally faced. The Ruhr had burned. The war machine had ended, and all that remained was to bear witness to the ruin it left behind. He turned to Weber. Prepare the reports. The leadership must understand what I have seen with my own eyes. There is no denying it anymore. The war is over, and the Ruhr is the proof. Outside, the firestorms continued, relentless and consuming. In the shadow of the ruins, the general realized the stark truth. Germany's industrial heart had been struck, its life drained, and even the mightiest generals could not cheat fate. The war was lost. March 17, 1945. Dawn broke over the Ruhr Valley, though the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick black smoke still rising from countless ruins. General von Salza stood on a small rise outside Essen, the cold wind cutting through his coat as he surveyed the destruction one last time. The horizon was a jagged line of smoldering factories, broken chimneys, and skeletal warehouses. In the valleys below, the rivers reflected fire like molten metal, a haunting mirror of the devastation. Hauptmann Weber, still by his side, remained silent. Words felt useless here. The landscape spoke for itself, a testament to the power of Allied air supremacy and to the futility of resisting it. Von Salza's eyes swept over what remained of the industrial complexes, now gutted and silent. He saw the scorched tracks of railroads, the collapsed roofs of assembly halls, the shattered remains of blast furnaces that had once belched fire to power an empire. Every brick, every twisted steel girder told the same story. The war machine was finished. The general lowered his binoculars and exhaled. Memories of campaigns past, Poland, France, the Eastern Front, flickered through his mind, juxtaposed against this unparalleled destruction. The Wehrmacht had fought bravely, but bravery could not replace steel and coal. It could not rebuild shattered factories or rekindle lost morale. It could not undo the relentless calculus of Allied bombing. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, had been rendered impotent. And with it, the nation's capacity to wage war had ceased. Von Salza turned to Weber, voice quieter than usual. "Document everything, Hauptmann. For history, for Berlin, let it be known that the war did not end in a single battle or on the battlefield. It ended here in fire, smoke, and steel, in the ashes of the Ruhr. Below them, the city groaned with its final convulsions. Collapsing structures sent clouds of dust into the air. Fires crackled in abandoned factories. The faint echo of distant sirens reminded them that life, though battered, still persisted. Civilians scavenged for food. Soldiers sought shelter. And yet the machinery of war that had defined Germany's power for years was gone, beyond repair. Von Salza's gaze lingered on the horizon. For decades he had believed in victory through discipline, tactics, and the prowess of the German army. But now he understood something deeper. The war was fought not just with soldiers, but with the unyielding infrastructure that supplied them. And once that lifeblood was destroyed, even the most disciplined army, even the most brilliant generals were powerless. The general turned away from the burning horizon and descended toward the command post. Reports would be filed, meetings held, orders given, but the truth could not be altered. The Ruhr had burned. Germany's industrial might was no more. The Wehrmacht could fight on in isolated pockets, but the war itself had already been lost. As he walked, von Salza felt a profound mixture of sorrow and clarity. He had witnessed the collapse of a war machine, seen the end of an era defined by steel and ambition, and come to accept the inevitability of defeat. The firestorm over the Ruhr was not just destruction, it was revelation. And as the smoke continued to rise into the early morning sky, von Salza understood the final truth that even the mightiest generals must sometimes confront. The war was finished and there was no turning back.